Okay, thank you very much, Professor Calder. You have mentioned the trilateral cooperation, U.S., Korea, Japan, and the historical perspective, policy perspective, and also, well, a lot of political challenges and tasks. So that issue will be very critical, both in security and economic realm for South Korea. And well, not only at the summit level, well, the trilateral summit is certainly important. That will be the major driving force, but I do hope at many other levels, senior officers level, track 1.5, track 2, more civilian expert level, I hope that this triangular the cooperation will be more institutionalized in the forthcoming years. Okay, we have roughly around 25 minute, maximum 30 minute discussion. And today I'm also very happy to have also renowned scholar, Professor John Nielsen Wright from Cambridge University. Kindly attended today's lecture, and he will also be at the round table tomorrow at Ilmin Institute. And we also have Professor Yi Xinhua, the real expert in multilateral diplomacy and Korea's foreign policy. We also have Dr. Nam Myung-yeol from Economic Institute, Economic Security Institute, who recently opened, but very active, the pillar of economic security. So why don't, before opening the floor, I do see the famous journalist down there, and Dr. Nam Jung-ho, who was a leading journalist at Chungang Daily. Nowadays also working for the Korea the Journalism Foundation. So why don't I bring Professor Nielsen Wright, John, to the first comment.
Thank you very much. And let me just sort of echo what Professor Calder was saying. What a pleasure it is to be here at such an important time to celebrate the anniversary of your institute. I thought Professor Calder gave a very compelling and I think important description of just how much progress there has been in the consolidation of ties between Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. And I think your argument for further institutionalization is really a very compelling one because of all of the challenges that the Trump administration represents. In a spirit of contrariness, if I can put it in those terms, from the vantage point of the United Kingdom, where we are a pragmatic country, but sometimes inclined to be somewhat pessimistic. I wanted to sort of raise some of the pessimistic aspects of the relationship and just get a sense, both from you and also from our Korean colleagues, about what the limits are to developing that more developed and sustainable institutional relationship. Just today, in the wake of course, the dramatic events in the United States, and the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've heard statements from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, suggesting that there needs to be, and I'm paraphrasing here, a government initiative to restrict the activity of what are being labeled as left-wing radical organizations, and included in that group are organizations like George Soros's Open Society Foundation, the Ford Foundation, which have been at the heart of civil society and public educational culture in the United States. And I think that's relevant because when we think about institutional cooperation, Professor Calder rightly emphasized the importance of science and technology. And as a university employee, I wonder about how fragile, I think fragile was the right adjective to use to describe the challenges we're facing. How fragile are those educational institutions in the United States? And how best can outside partners, outside universities, compensate for some of that fragility? Because it seems to me, when I look at admittedly from an ad hoc perspective, we see a lot of alarm and concern on the part of people in STEM about their ability in the United States to sustain the research they do. And whether we describe it as the military-industrial complex, or we think about how in the Cold War government played a key role in sustaining the relationship between universities and the private sector, there is surely a big question mark about whether that is going to be sustainable over the long term, particularly if those institutions that have been responsible for providing funding and support in an open society context are themselves at risk. And allied to that is, of course, the sustainability of public media. So my question, I suppose, is to what extent does that trend that we're seeing within the Trump administration undercut all of those important other areas of cooperation? My second question comes back to this question of how liberal democratic states like South Korea and Japan are responding not only to the immediate strategic challenge they face in their own neighborhoods, whether it's Ukraine and Russia in the case of Europe, but also in the case of the Indo-Pacific, the challenge of China and North Korea, by building their own new minilateral partnerships. Japan and Australia, for example, have a very close security partnership, underscored by initiatives such as the Reciprocal Access Agreement between the two countries, the Arms and Cross Services Agreement. To what extent are those sorts of initiatives something that should be expanded to include countries like South Korea? And to what extent would that sort of more ambitious regional minilateralism be seen as complementary to the existing US, ROK, Japan minilateral partnership, or potentially at odds with those initiatives? How would they be received in Washington? It's also something that, from the vantage point of the United Kingdom, we are thinking about much more actively. Britain has, on the back of the G7 summit and the Hiroshima Accord, a very close, perhaps it's never been closer, bilateral partnership with Japan. And also as a result of the global pivotal state initiative of the previous administration in this country, the UK and South Korea have a now much stronger partnership, underscored by the Downing Street Accord. It seems increasingly obvious from the vantage point of London that Britain should be partnering with both South Korea and Japan. How would those sorts of initiatives be viewed in Washington? So, minilateral coordination and the questions of the integrity of our research communities and universities are the sort of the issues that I wanted to raise in this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you like me to respond now, or do you want me to? I mean, I could very briefly
Oh, sure.
and concisely.
Definitely.
Yeah, on minilateral coordination, I don't think that there's sort of a categorical rejection. If you take, for example, both Vance, the response of both Vance and Trump to Europe's announcement that it was going to fund support for Ukraine, and all of these efforts within NATO to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP. I don't think those are necessarily contradictory. I mean, the U.S. is applauding, whether in the long run, applauding these these moves to minilateralism will actually backfire on the U.S., that over time people will realize that these other relationships are more predictable and more comfortable and so on. There may be some of that. At least right now, I don't think Washington is responding negatively. They're saying, well, you're taking some of the burden off of us. And I think it's also worth noting that the burden has been somewhat asymmetrical, although not to the degree maybe that Washington says, but still the U.S. has, in many cases, played a larger role. Now, on the first point, I mean, I think their attack on NGOs and soft power and so on, sadly, what you describe, I think, is the reality. And in Washington, Washington is very much polarized on that particular point. Personally, as we've discussed, I think it's a terrible, terrible mistake. And I can see, some wisdom. Actually, we have a member of J.D. Vance's staff that's joined in the Reischauer Center, one of them, and we like to maintain ties with both sides of the aisle. And on the second point, I can see some of the things that's being said. But on the first, I can't see much at all. And I do believe that it's a terrible mistake to undercut the role of universities and NGOs, because especially if there's conflict, soft power can often be the most important way of bridging differences. So, anyway.
Then, may I invite Professor Lee?
Thank you very much, Ken, for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation that gave us, I'm sure, a lot of thoughts to our students as well. I have two questions. In interest of time, I will save my comments. Maybe we can talk about it over lunch. First of all, the Camp David you was talking about. The Camp David, quite a few people start to worry about or let it turn out to become a dinosaur. Because the three men, the real men who made it possible are already gone from the international stage, right? And also in the case of the Trump, he appears to quote unquote decouple Japan and Korea in terms of he's dealing with important economic and security agendas. In that case, and I don't think we haven't heard much from Trump to talk about trilateral cooperation among our three countries, although I fully agree with you saying strategic importance of this trilateralism is more and more important. Mm-hmm. So what I'm asking you is, in particular, if the Takaichi Shinai is becoming a prime minister, with the Trump and Lee Jae-myung in Korea, I don't see much progress or optimistic prospect. I don't see much of those things in the near future. So what is your best bet for the future of this trilateralism? What condition will make a best scenario, and what would be the worst? Mm-hmm. So that was my first question. Okay. And then quickly, the second one is, you haven't touched upon it, but the term, the Indo-Pacific, speaking of the multilateralism, I think multilateralism become a buzzword and flourishing terminology under the Biden, because he was highlighting importance of like-minded the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And also, as you know, the Trump was the person under his first term who picked up Abe's term of the Indo-Pacific, and then he even changed the Pacific Command name to the Indo-Pacific. But now they are saying that the Indo-Pacific is going down, partly because of the India's a dubious position, but mainly because of the uncertainty about the U.S. commitment to that region called the Indo-Pacific. So, what do you think about the prospect or future of the Indo-Pacific? Are we going back to Asia-Pacific, or we have to be more consolidating under the name of the East Asia, just what we did after in the wake of the Asian financial crisis? So that was two questions of mine.
Those are fascinating comments, and the last one I think is particularly timely. There is a real spiral downward, I think, in relations between the U.S. and India, and particularly given, I mean, some of it is just personal, and Modi and Trump are both, you know, highly charged, somewhat, some would say, narcissistic personalities, and so that's part of it. But there's, you know, fundamental difference of interest. And that's especially interesting because I think the Indo-Pacific concept actually was driven not by the United States. It was really driven by Prime Minister Abe. It's a Japanese idea more than an American. And, you know, the interests of, I think, of Japan, not that, I mean, if America's global interest, there's an interest in, you know, supporting and furthering alliances. If that's the way one believes, then there's a rationale for it along that line. But I don't think, in a narrow sense, that including India, if you look at the economic relationships, the India relationship is somewhat peripheral compared to those, say, with Japan and Korea. So I can believe that we are possibly going back to, practically speaking, to a Asia Pacific. Not to say that we'll try to really purposely ignore and antagonize India, but if you consider what's involved in making concessions to India, as long as India, for example, is exporting, you know, they used to import 1% of their oil from Russia, and now it's 38% in the midst of a war that Trump is trying to see ended. So I think there's a fundamental difference, and I think we've come to the view that India is, you know, not moving toward alliance relationships. It's a balancer. And the other side of that is that they'll continue to be a balancer, and their national interest is some relationship with the United States. I think, of course, there is a strong Indian-American constituency in Washington, but right now I don't think that it's strongly supportive of Modi on, for example, human rights questions. It's quite critical of Modi. So I don't see U.S.-India reconciliation in the near future as moving very rapidly. Now, on your other, so I tend to agree with your observation in that. On the other points about Camp David and its meaning, about the decoupling of Japan and Korea, I would agree with you that Trump is trying, as he is all over the world, to encourage competition. He's trying to make people fight with each other, even if they're allies sometimes. There's that dimension, but there's also, and I heard this directly from some people who were involved with the summit with Prime Minister Ishiba, that he was also rather supportive of that, at least at the level of the Ishiba meetings, supportive of that notion of Korea and the United States and Japan finding ways to collaborate. So to what extent is he really trying to decouple the two? I think that might be an overgeneralization, that if this is a question of trying to make them compete, say, in the auto investment in the United States on autos, say, where they are natural competitors anyway, there's that. Or pipelines. In fact, he said he had both Japan and Korea are going to invest in the Alaska pipeline. At that level, yes, but not in the more general sense. One other thing in that regard, there's people like, over in the working level. I could mention names offline, but many of the people who are working on these issues operationally also see now in the Trump administration see the importance of cooperation. So I do think that I can't speak to what the intentions of President Lee might be. Our impression of the readout, and the fact that he visited Japan is his first overseas visit, suggests that he is trying to engage in some degree of reconciliation. So those are, I agree with you largely, but with a few sort of nuances.
Wonderful. We have roughly 5 minutes left, but why don't I open the floor? And students are also welcome to raise a question. Of course, we have the other renowned expert here also, but why this time, why don't I invite one student question? Please.
Thank you so much for your lecture, Professor. My name is Shruti, and I'm a third semester student at KUGSIS. So you talked about the importance of trilateral cooperation, especially because of growing cooperation between North Korea and Russia and Russia and China. So in the same context, how do you look at the recent military parade that was held in China, where we saw Russia, China, and North Korean leaders in one frame? So how do you assess its significance for this trilateral cooperation and its importance for other regional powers in Indo-Pacific region?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that interesting question. I do think that these kind of meetings, like relating to the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, in terms of deepening personal ties, that they're probably useful, especially with the general publics. And for North Korea, of course, Kim Jong-un has not been in this kind of broad international environment at all. It's a first, I think, for him, and given that he's been so isolated, maybe that is the thing to be highlighted. But one element of the cooperation is the Indians, and sort of following with what I said earlier, Prime Minister Modi was fairly ostentatious about the collaboration, and there's Indian representation at the military exercises between Russia and Belarus as well. I guess I just think that there's considerable limits to this, that after all, the differences between India and China in particular are so deep, and there's a direct military challenge for India, that there's limits to how far that will go. So it was a good time to sort of celebrate symbolically some joint some solidarity. But substantively, I would say, particularly regarding India's relationship to those, I don't think that you'll probably see much longer term significance. That may be just a wishful view from Washington. I don't know, but at least that's my sense.
Maybe one last question? Dr. No.
Yes.
Sure.
I'm Dr. Nam in Institute for Economy, Technology, and Security. I have one quick question. So many people said there will be some conflict between China and Taiwan in 2027. So how do you expect the responsibility or the role of Korea's side naval sea power?
Wow. That is a very delicate question. I look forward to discussing over lunch. I guess what I would say, we can't forget that Korea, of course, has very deep economic relations with mainland China, with the PRC. And it has not only deep ties, it has a considerable surplus. And also we know that China tends to be, as they were, for example, in the over-the-horizon radar, the issues a few years ago, they tend to be quite, was it Lucky, I'm trying to think, Lucky Gold Star, they were quite vindictive as well. Now that doesn't mean that strategically speaking, what Korea does is not relevant. I guess as far as such things is concerned, my sense, especially given the Trump administration's pragmatism, deal orientation, the most likely scenarios are not somewhere Korea would be expected to be engaged in some sort of direct military involvement in relation to a Taiwan contingency, but more likely economic, maybe some blockade kind of scenario. Mainly that's going to affect like the Philippine Sea and the relationship between Guam, say, the Guam and across the Taiwan Straits, those kind of things. Or most likely some sort of manipulation of domestic groups inside Taiwan. The legislative yuan, for example, right now is quite divided. And China is already said to be somewhat, dabbling in troubled waters that way. And given Trump, I think they may think that they can do what they want to do without military action. Now, that isn't to say that that will happen that way, but I just think the probability of the kind of scenarios that would involve Korea militarily are relatively limited. I could be wrong, and you may be thinking differently. They're relatively limited, and it's also, those would be very difficult for Korea, especially with a Lee administration, would be my guess.
Okay, well, I do know that, this discussion can last a couple more hours intensely, but unfortunately, I just found the time really flied at this time. But we certainly enjoyed the knowledge and insight of Professor Kent Calder, and also Professor John Nielsen Wright, Professor Yi Shin-hwa, Dr. Nam Young-yeol. They share a lot of their insight too. So in that, so I do appreciate there's a feast of knowledge in this session. And I should also mention that, the Ilmin staffs, Professor Yeo Young-yoon, Dr. Yang Ji-hye, So-hee, and other, and Hwa Kyung, we had Minu too, but the Ilmin staffs, really did a lot of work, and very sincerely organized this event and tomorrow's event. So I will mention a lot of appreciation, but I will start the first appreciation here. And you can also find a very well made, nice poster with your face in it. So on your way out, we will show you that poster. And okay, so upon that note, why don't you join me thanking Professor Kent Calder with a big round of applause.